Halo 1 sits on a lofty tower of success, which means Halo 2, its sequel, needs to try and achieve something similar, especially after the first game is considered something of a hit. And this can be a bit of a complicating factor. It's a second album problem. How do you capitalise on your forward momentum? What do you expand on? What do you take out? This is when a franchise can really cement itself, especially as games become blockbusters in scope and budget. So, let's look at how Bungie think about this problem and how they end up moving forward in today's Halo 2 retrospective. One quick note, as with Halo 1, I am going to be playing the remastered version on the Master Chief Collection. This time I pretty much stuck with the old graphics mode throughout because I was so disappointed with the updated graphics and the artistic changes in the first game. I did test it from time to time and they did seem less jarring this time. I decided to stick with the older graphics. I mean, I'm still trying to find out if this fascination with older graphics is an oldies fascination with my own youth and games of it, or is it another particular type of philosophical navel gazing? Do they actually bring something separate to the party themselves? I like to think the latter, but I need to navel gaze about this a little longer. The Master Chief Collection does continue to leave this patina of distrust over the version I'm playing. Are the issues that I'm having with Halo 2 the fault of the game, or is it the Master Chief Collection version? In sections, the music just ends up feeling really toned down. I could barely pick up on it, and it was odd in its absence. And it becomes even more noticeable in the moments when I did change to the updated graphics and the music comes through at what I would say is an adequate volume. I did a quick Google and it confirms that I'm not the only person with this issue. But more mechanical things like saves being a little on the sporadic side become harder to pinpoint because of this. Is this a fault of the Master Chief Collection, or is this just a fault of Halo 2? That is to say, the Master Chief Collection had these two faults. Now let's get into the game and something a bit more definitive. The guns. Dual wielding is the first big innovation of the day, being able to pick up two weapons at once that are single-handed to be used at the same time. In concept, the idea of picking up one of the new SMGs and the old plasma pistol and having them work in tandem is great. Melting the shields of an enemy with a pistol and then killing them with the SMG. It adds to the feeling of being this scavenger warrior who uses whatever he can in his battlefield to survive. Combining weapons is one of the cores of Halo's combat, and a tricky fight can often be solved by changing what you're wielding. This new dual wielding in reality is just how Halo has always worked. You just get to fire them at the same time. You see, originally you always had two weapon slots, as well as your set of grenades on the side. So the ability to dual wield basically means that one of these weapon slots can be used for an additional two weapons, giving you 3 in total. But the caveat to this is that if you throw a grenade, melee, or swap to your second slot, you drop one of these dual wielded weapons. This adds a layer of maintenance, another job, some upkeep to do in the middle of combat if you want to keep your current loadout. When you're in an area that has already had a protracted combat, you can lose that essential weapon, especially as the weapons of the enemies pile up. It feels fiddly. And all of that with little added benefit. This is how the weapons always worked in Halo, you can just switch between the two you need. And I can imagine in an online situation that this adds a layer of complexity that was really beneficial, but within the single player I felt it was superfluous. The actual weapons themselves herald probably one of the biggest changes in the game. I mean, one of the ways to successfully update a game is to add more guns. They increase the range of player experience and offer something to experiment with, especially to the people returning. This then has to be balanced with the flow and the feel of game, of course, but more is often seen as better in the world of games. Halo the first had 8 weapons in total, with the 2 grenades. The second increases this by almost double, giving you 14 weapons with the 2 grenades also. There are weapons that are multiplayer only. Again, we are looking at the single player game, so let's ignore those. The major changes I can see between the two arsenals is the addition and expansion to include more precision weapons. A notable weapon from the first Halo is the assault rifle. You'll encounter it plenty of times on the ring world, but look at the reticule for it. It's wide. There is a large area that you can place it where it will be effective, where it will do damage to the enemy. It feels to some degree inaccurate at first pass, but in the context of a console shooter it makes perfect sense. You have less fidelity over your aim and the gun adjusts for this. Now, let's look at the battle rifle in Halo 2, its counterpart and actually its replacement. It has much higher accuracy, reflected in the reticule. The assault rifle has disappeared completely. In total, 2 weapons in Halo 1 are precision, out of the 8. Whereas in Halo 2, out of the 14 weapons, 5 are precision, a much higher ratio. This signals a core change in the design philosophy between the 2 games. In terms of actually playing in the modern day, I prefer the guns in Halo 2, although I think the design of the guns in the first game are much more interesting. One of the primary reasons I prefer to change to precision weapons is playing on keyboard and mouse. I can just perfectly line up those headshots. He speaks of his skill at the game in much higher regard than he actually has, but it is much easier to do that repeatedly with some level of success. The original catering mostly to controller and how they balance the weapon is key to that game's success. Viewing this with the added perspective of time brings another layer. Shooters these days do not shy away from accuracy on controllers, instead opting for aim assist to aid it. The iron sights, bringing it up on your actual assault rifles to shoot and be more accurate is much more common, and it's something very different from the first Halo. But the style and changes presented between these 2 games are important steps on the evolutionary track of console shooters. And the changes didn't stop Halo 2 from selling well. Having something that's so designed for such a particular thing and being so successful of that is just flat out more interesting to me than being given what I prefer to play with in terms of weaponry. The critique I do have of the functionality of these weapons is that they end up being replicated across the arsenal. Yeah, we have 14 weapons, but a Covenant carbine rifle functions very similarly to the battle rifle. There are 2 sniper rifles that function pretty much exactly the same. Some of the flavour, some of the uniqueness between the factions is gone here. In the first, I always felt like I was thinking about my armoury a lot more, changing it up as was required. It was much more like this scavenger, going and getting whatever I could. Weapons running out of ammo and having to be forced to use something different. In the second, it feels like I was going to run across a gun that I liked with a greater deal of ease and was able to maintain that particular armoury for a longer period of time. Often Terran guns in the first game were relatively rare. You were fighting an insurgent battle, your armoury was on a crashed ship somewhere else, and that forced you to use the weird and wonderful alien weaponry. Now, I know there are new guns, some of the weird and wonderful alien weaponry we are now familiar with, it isn't weird and wonderful anymore. This combined with the fact that the Terran armoury is now replicated in a lot of these alien guns, does just mean that there was always something there for me and it didn't feel as fresh and interesting as the first game, even though the weapons set practically doubled. The endgame messes with this formula of just always having the correct loadout. There are a greater number of configurations of different enemies, especially with the new enemy types in each of the factions. Whereas the intro, because it hasn't introduced some of these things, suffers from a bit more staleness. We are just coming into similar combat scenarios from the first game. And I think it's the Flood that are key to this. The parasites that infect a host of different wielding enemies, some human and some Covenant. They always bring a range of different types of weaponry to the situation, meaning you have a greater choice to pick from. But you've also got a new type of enemy to fight, so the considerations multiply. In addition to this, we have changes to the health bar. It's gone. Now you can take a couple of shots when your shields are low, but you will die when it runs out pretty quickly. The health bar was always like your backup. If that was being affected, you knew you could take a bit of damage, but you needed to get out of there. Now each time your shield gets low, you just want to be getting out of there straight away. It creates a lot more of a static sort of fight. I felt a lot more like I could weather the fire in Halo 1 and then dip into cover, whereas this I kind of wanted to always keep my shields relatively high, which to do that I stayed behind cover. The Maxim more is better applies to vehicles as well. Often they provided a tree to flavour the section, but now they operate as a requirement, often coupled with the tendency to throw wave after wave of enemy vehicles at you. And these waves tended to just have the same formations. You just get 3 ghosts coming at you, and you beat those, and you get another 3 ghosts coming at you, you beat those, and then you'll get another 3 ghosts coming at you. There is no variety here. There are a broader number of vehicles in the game, which is good. That does bring variety in itself, in both fighting and playing as those. So it wasn't that it wasn't fun, it's just there was a lot crammed in there. The last mechanical thing to discuss is when you're playing as the Arbiter, you have stealth. The Arbiter has the ability to cloak himself in some combat, adding this level of fluidity on how you initiate engagements usually, as well as disengage out of them. It's another layer that's fun to play with and helps differentiate between the two protagonists, although I never really felt I had like a solid use for it. There's no purpose-built sections, no requirements to be stealthy. It's a dash of flavour to a character that's already probably one of the better parts of this game. The big structural difference between these two games is worthy to look at also. One of the big compliments I gave the first game was the minimal story. It knew not to get in the way. It knew the combat is where the game sings and let the skyboxes speak almost separately from these. You get a small cutscene, a camera pan, and then a couple of lines of dialogue, and then you're into your next crafted combat section. That is very different here. There are long cutscenes telling you direct story. You have multiple characters where you find out different things, and in this Raiden-esque twist, that Arbiter we were talking about earlier, you play as him for a decent chunk of the game. You're not just there as Master Chief. The Arbiter takes the function of this religious special operative. Someone is expected to die for the Covenant in order to achieve their mission that currently is apparent to turn on the Halos, thusly clearing out the food for the Flood. In other words, all of life. This change of perspective that culminates in an internal struggle within the Covenant is important. Where in the first game the Covenant were just interpreted through gameplay and just seeing them, you never got a direct line into their story, who they were and what they stood for. For instance, in this game you see the Covenant getting hold of their Oracle, Guilty Spot 343, the person who ends up being your main antagonist in the first game. So it raises the question, why do the Covenant want to activate the Halos? Well, we get that explanation here. From our perspective, the operational use of the Halos is not a secret. Guilty Spark and the computers of Halo freely tell you what they are here to do. It is the active interpretation of the Covenant through a guise of religiosity that means that they choose to interpret it to their own ends. They are too willing to look past the truth, instead wanting the Halos to take them to the Promised Land. The language that they have developed to understand these things means that they are unable to actually dig deep and find out what's going to happen. Their own internal propaganda blinds them. This is all told in direct cutscenes where you get to see the other side. They speak to you, you interact with them, you get the Arbiter's perspective. You develop a whole idea of who the Covenant are, what they stand for. And this also applies to a new character that comes in, Gravemind, the end life form of the Flood. Now the Gravemind has a Destiny-ass name, I know, but it's a pretty cool introduction if it feels a little forced in, but it gives perspective to the Flood, as well as this added perspective we're getting to the Covenant. Now, this game comes out in an era of like the initial rumblings of the New Atheist movement, and you can't help but see some of this here with the Covenant's religiosity. But I think the fact it's expanded upon and you're getting an inside perspective from the Arbiter means this read is a little one-sided. For the Covenant, it becomes political as much as it is religious. The Arbiter's own race, the elites, end up being ousted completely, with the brutes being put in charge. That's what this game is about, the internal workings of the various aliens. And that's much more entertaining than the humans. None of the humans quite feel like they fit into this story. The last paragraph explains a complex interaction between religious leads, propaganda interpretation, with a dash of the political intrigue. The humans are just in a war film. They operate on one-liners and just shooting through the Covenant. There's not much to them, they function as oversized tropes rather than anything else. Although this may work in Bungie's favour, it allows the humans to be easy and uncomplicated to play as. You know their aims, you understand their struggle and why they do it. The lack of depth makes them an easy faction to embody. So we have the longer cutscenes that give us an in-depth look at the various races. This is paired with the continuation of Bungie's other signature thing, the Skybox. There are many good ones in this game that are there to spice up the environments. They elevate the area you're fighting in and often bring an added context. The big Covenant ship over the human city, the falling platform you're fighting on as the Arbiter, and the underwater tunnels that link different parts of Halo together are all great. It's ended up being a bit of a rambly one, this has, which I'm not sure why, but let's try and draw some conclusions from what I've said. So to conclude, Halo 2 is more Halo. A lot more. This comes with the benefit of a more realised story, some of the new weapons being genuinely great, and an increase in the series' signature bombast. But it comes with it not being too well thought out. Halo 1 succeeds because it does not let anything get in the way of its core. Halo 2 succeeds because it adds so much that you don't notice when it gets in the way. There are interviews that provide a post-mortem on this game, and they say that too much was added too greedily, and that bringing all of these components at the end was a nightmare. And you can kind of tell. But there is enough that holds up from what makes the original work, and enough that expands on the premise. I love the story as it came to its conclusion. The big factional battles within the Covenant really give a sense that their existence is as much political as it is theological, whilst leaving enough to allow player-directed interjection and expansion on these ideas. One of the aspects of Halo that I always found sort of confusing from an outside perspective were the supplementary books for the story and lore. It never came across to me as a series that had story and lore that was worth diving into, as it said from an outsider's perspective, and this game showed me something different to that. There are many interesting threads here that I'd like to see more of, but don't expect me to go and read these books anytime soon. I've got too many books to read. The changes in combat remain interesting when compared to how tight the first game is. The stepping away from something that is so tuned for a specific thing. I do miss something in that purity from the first Halo. Everything has this feeling of being meticulously crafted to create something with a core design philosophy. 2 is the add everything style of production, but some of the new components are good, so there we go. We have the dark horse of the series done. Join me in completion of the original series, and what potentially held up as the pinnacle of the series, Halo 3. Retrospective on a YouTube channel near you. Well, this channel. YouTube site near you. Retrospective near you. Thank you for watching. My name has been Billy. Goodbye.